Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I was like coming to Perth. There. I'll talk about the idea of the social license. You may have heard of the concept. I'll just give you an introduction, and hopefully you'll find it a useful concept for organizing ideas and frameworks and techniques from stakeholder relations and issues management. The idea of the social license started as a metaphor. It was coined by, now this is going to get feedback. It was coined by a guy named Jim Cooney, who was at that time vice president of external affairs for Placer Dome, which was then the third largest gold mining company in the world. And during the late 90s, all of the largest mining companies had some sort of a crisis, tailings dams, failures, and protests and boycotts and blockades, and they were having their operations shut down, which was very costly. And so to sort of put a label on this and draw management attention to it, Jim coined the term social license as an analogy to the legal license, to say that we not only need to make sure we get our legal licenses in order to operate, we also have to get a social license, just to draw attention to the social side. So it became, he used it in a meeting with the World Bank, and then they used it at a conference, and it spread throughout the mining industry originally, and came to be understood as something that's granted by the community, that's renewable daily, that you have to keep working on, and that is basically ongoing acceptance or approval of the project. And you could just call it that if you wanted to. If you don't like the word license, and a lot of people don't, then you can just call it community acceptance or stakeholder acceptance or approval. It means the same thing. So the concept has evolved since then, and Susan Joyce and Ian Thomson specified 3 levels of social license. There's the lowest level where you don't have it, and your project is stopped, shut down, blockaded, or something like that. Then there's the bare acceptance level, where it's being tolerated tentatively with reservations, but it's still going forward. And then there's the support level. Then Ian Thomson and I added a 4th level, which is psychological identification, when the support actually becomes institutionalized. We also embedded it in management theory to sort of give it a academic pedigree, because it is an example of theories that already exist in management theory. It's resource dependence theory, and we also applied a new technique, which is stakeholder analysis, the stakeholder network analysis, in order to solve some of the problems about defining who is a stakeholder and which ones should receive priority. And then Leora Black here published her book on the social license, and published the first measurement scales for it and some factor analyses. John Morrison published a book in 2014. He's a human rights activist who advanced the concept quite a bit, saying that all organizations need to get a social license for their activities. Even NGOs and governments. He also tied it to the concept of the social contract. So it's sort of like not only just local community acceptance, but it can be applied to a whole industry. So, for example, the fracking industry is on the verge. In some places, they've lost their social license to operate. So at that level of the whole social contract, the role of an industry in society can come into question, and they can lose their legitimacy. So, and then myself and some colleagues went a little bit further in trying to quantify this and turn it into something that you could put into a spreadsheet instead of something that just sits in a Microsoft Word file. And we did an agent-based modeling, so you could simulate the political dynamics that swirl around a given project and predict which initiatives with stakeholders would give you a higher social license in the short term or the long term, and compare different initiatives using a computer simulation of the politics. So the social license is issued by a stakeholder network, and the network is a way of revealing which stakeholders have power and influence to enforce their views on the whole network. And it's issued originally it was issued to a mining project, but now it can be not just a project, but a subunit within a company. Or, for example, we had one case where a community shut down a mining operation because they didn't like the company doctor, and they wanted to change the HR department, but they couldn't withdraw the social license from just those units, so they had to shut the whole thing down, even though that's a subunit that they had the problem with. And so whole industries, even whole sectors of the economy could gain a higher social license or have their social license lowered or withdrawn. The usage of the term is spreading through infrastructure, energy, construction, agriculture. There was a book published in Australia called The Social License to Irrigate, water usage, agriculture issues. And government as well, they have to have social license for their regulatory process. We had a case in Canada, where I'm from, where a government regulator lost its social license to issue legal licenses. And that was the National Energy Board, and the controversy over pipelines to move heavy oil, bitumen from the Alberta oil sands to the coast. And the activists and opponents submitted presentations to the hearings that would have taken 7 to 9 years to hear them all, and that was deliberate, and they said it was deliberate. We're going to slow this down until it becomes uneconomical. And so the government changed the criteria for accepting submissions to their regulatory hearings, and then there was protests against that, and they basically lost their social license. The head of the National Energy Board was replaced, and it became a big scandal. And now it continues to be a political hot button. It's become a political issue, and it's actually caused a split in one of the political parties in Canada. But, even governments and regulators need a social license to issue legal licenses. So the usage is spreading. And when NGOs go into a different country, for example, they need to get a social license to do their operations there. This is the model that Ian Thomson and I developed with the 4 levels of the social license. There's when you don't have a social license, it's withdrawn or withheld. And the colors going from red to green indicate low support to high support. The width here indicates where most mining companies sit, and just having a minimum social license. There's always people with reservations and so forth. From a lot of interviews with stakeholders, we heard them say that when a company loses its social license, it loses legitimacy. So legitimacy is one of the boundary criteria for moving up and having a mere minimum social license, called acceptance or tolerance, if you like, tentative acceptance, if you like. And to go any higher, you need to be perceived as being credible, and those are the words of the stakeholders again. From decades of interviewing them. And once the perception of credibility is achieved, you actually start to get positive support. where stakeholders will actually go out and march in support of your project against critics. They'll ignore the critics. And then over time, it can become institutionalized, full trust will develop, and there'll be a psychological identification with the industry or the project. And you see that kind of thing in a lot of mining towns, but you see it also, for example, in Hollywood, identified psychologically with the film industry, and Silicon Valley with the computer industry, London with the banking industry, and things like that. So that gets to that level of community acceptance, not just individual stakeholder group acceptance. And it varies across time. This is an example of research we did from Minera San Cristobal in the Altiplano of Bolivia. It's at the roof of the world, 4 kilometers above sea level, not much oxygen. And they discovered the silver, zinc, lead deposit there in 1994, people's expectations soared, the dreams of becoming rich, and then they had to relocate the village, and there were some problems with that, and then metal prices declined, and the project got put on hold, and people became discouraged. They still wanted to go ahead, but now they had a lot of reservations about this. Is it really going to happen? Were we sold a bill of goods? Were we hoodwinked or something? So the company started some economic development projects to keep the spirits up while they're waiting for prices to recover. They did recover. Construction started, and a different management team came in with a tight deadline and didn't have time to talk to the villagers, didn't know anything about the agreements that had been made or promises that had been made, and that's eventually one of the subcontractors bulldozed the community garden, which was the food supply for the next year. And the villagers said, this is illegitimate. Again, that word came up, and they blocked the road and construction stopped. And that started costing a lot of money, and so the construction managers suddenly found the time to talk to the villagers, and they got things going again. Then when everybody started getting jobs, the level of support soared again. We came in 2009 and expanded the definition of the stakeholder network to include people much farther away, and it turned out the social license dropped when we expanded that definition of who's in the population of stakeholders, because there were groups further away who were experiencing relative poverty. So the mine workers were getting rich and starting to buy big pickup trucks and buy real estate in their surrounding towns, and the other people weren't seeing any benefits at all. In fact, they were seeing inflation without much income, and they wanted to shut down the mine because it was creating inequality, and that's a big no-no in the Altiplano culture. And so we started talking to them and decided that, well, another alternative to shutting down the mine is to create regional economic development. And through that, they were able to create more linkages between these surrounding groups and the communities closer to the mine where the workers lived. And eventually, more quinoa was planted and more irrigation infrastructure was built. And quinoa prices happened to go up 600% during that period. And now the whole region sees that the market economy has something to offer them, whereas previously it was nationalize all the infrastructure companies, especially those foreigners. So things changed politically as they went through that economic development. So that was the strategy for diffusing that opposition. Bring them along. The relationship between the social license and the legal license, it's often necessary because there's governance gaps, or the reach of the state won't go as far as the project goes. Lots of examples where a project is operating in a place where the government doesn't have much presence and somebody else is in charge, and you have to deal with them in order to get anything done. Have to create your own order. Or there's other cases where there's governments, but too many of them claiming responsibility for or powers over the same decisions. And then a social license becomes useful to help sort all that competing claims, sort out all those competing claims. And we see situations where the social license actually becomes a legal requirement. So the Supreme Court of Canada has declared that all extractive industry projects have to have a community benefit agreement signed. So that means going out and getting your social license with the communities before you can get your legal license. And as I mentioned, that National Energy Board event. And when the National Energy Board finally did approve the pipeline project, they had 209 conditions on it, and several of those, about a dozen of those, were get your legal license before you come back to us asking for, get your social license before you ask for a legal license. You don't always need a social license. For example, in Finland, where the government used to run the mines, they had elections instead, and that was the legitimacy for the project. And everyone trusted the regulator to look after the community's interests. So it was already all covered already under the legal license in that circumstance. That's fairly rare. The other circumstance where you don't need a legal license or social license is the exact opposite, where the government isn't looking after any of the interests of the local communities. You got a dictator in charge, and they're just taking the royalties, and you better not complain. So even if you don't approve, even though the local community doesn't approve of the project, there's not much they can do. So we've figured out a way to measure the level of social license a project has. We use this in mining, but also in mining operations, exploration. We've done projects using similar techniques in port, several urban toll roads, and electrical transmission right-of-ways, and so forth. Energy projects. But this is just the mining projects we've done. So we had 12 agree-disagree statements that we present to leaders of stakeholder organizations in an interview, and they rate their level of agreement on a 5-point scale. And they're mostly focusing on the quality of the relationship with the project proponents or operators, because that's comparable across cultures and across time. So rather than focusing on impacts, which change from place to place and time to time, the human relationships are more universal, and they automatically reflect all of the other impacts of things, they reflect the effects of the project's impacts. So all of that's rolled into the perceptions of the quality of the relationship by the stakeholder themselves automatically. So it's very efficient in that way. So we've got over 2,100 interviews now, and 23 studies at 47 mining projects, 11 countries, 4 continents, and 9 languages. So it provides kind of a normative standard against which you could compare your own scores. The mean right now is at 3.39 on a 5-point scale, which is pretty typical for perception data. The stakeholder network analysis is the way the technique we've used for deciding which stakeholders to include and which ones to give priority to. All interaction always occurs in networks anyway. You're going to have an impact on the network, but with a stakeholder network analysis, you can at least see be conscious of the impact you're having, and you can make deliberate decisions about how you want to change the shape of the network instead of it happening haphazardly. Yeah, and if you have a more accurate view of what the network looks like, you'll have more influence within that network. That's been shown in other studies. It helps you define the network boundaries, and one of the methods we use, besides the other obvious ones, is we ask stakeholders who else is interested or has a stake in this project, and then we go talk to them. The three kinds of data that we put together to develop strategies for stakeholder engagement and for raising your level of social license are the strength of the ties amongst the stakeholders themselves. How are they organized? Are they form a tight cluster, or are they all over the place? They don't talk to each other. All of that makes a big difference to your strategy, because basically what you want to do is strengthen the supporters' influence in the stakeholder network. And that's usually through having them form more dense network ties and being connected more broadly throughout the whole network. So you have to know what their connections look like currently in order to strategize for improving their influence. So improving the influence of the supporters and recruiting more supporters is the basic approach. So with the network data, you get a good picture on that. Then you ask them about their issues and concerns, because in order to do anything to change the network structure, you're going to have to engage them in some kind of a discussion or dialogue or initiative, and that will be determined by what they're concerned about. And then the level of social license is what you're trying to change in the end. So this is an example of a stakeholder network from a composite of different construction projects for housing developments. And here you've got the ones at the top are more influential. The colors indicate their level of social license they grant. So you can see that these two communities are the most influential. These ones who are supporters are not as influential. So you can actually you can deliberately set up initiatives to add in more network ties, to introduce groups to each other, get them working together so they have stronger relationships, and that will increase the influence of the supporters. So you also need to know about their concerns and their priorities and their complaints. And we've got several techniques that I'll just jump through here to show you how it is possible to quantify these and track them across time. Normally they're just sort of verbal descriptions, but you can actually quantify them, count them, graph them, and track them across time. This is an example of this bar graph of these concerns, counts the number of people per capita who've mentioned each of these issues. This is the same data presented in a much more easily understandable visual. This is an important distinction here. What people say they're concerned about when you first ask them isn't always what's going to solve the problem. And the biggest difference here is people will say they're concerned about the environment when really they're concerned about not having been included in the decision process or feeling like they haven't been listened to. That's the biggest surprise you'll find. So if you just take the first thing they say as the problem without probing further, you'll end up, like in one case we heard of a company that, they heard that the project was too close to the river. So they moved the river. And when that was done, they still had a problem. People, well, that wasn't the real complaint. The complaint was, you're not listening to us. But they just took the surface presenting environmental issue as the end of the problem, and it wasn't. So if you ask people, why is that important to you? Why is that issue a concern to you? How does that affect you? You start to get deeper. And this is an example of the kind of graphing you can do of just counting the mentions of the first problem and then what they said was behind that or why that was important to them. And you get up to things like values. And then you can start to see where different stakeholder groups have common ground. And they could be brought together in a coalition of supporters. This is the other way it can go. When you ask them about why that's important to them, they'll start giving you a chain of consequences, and then you can figure out where the leverage point is to deal with the problem. This was from the closure of a mine, and by asking them, why is that important to you, and adding up collectively their answers, we got this basic cycle here that was important, and the leverage points being helping them find new jobs and developing agriculture. So that at the beginning we heard all sorts of ideas about what was the problem and what should be done, but by collating together all of their ideas about what causes what, we were able to identify the leverage points, and they corroborated this in a workshop. So 5 typical steps for getting a social license. Get organized internally first, so bond before you bridge, and then move to your supporters next, and then move beyond that to opponents. For content of engagement, listen to stakeholders. They'll tell you what the initiative's content should be. Just listen. Take responsibility for your impacts. It's not just a PR exercise. You actually have to change what you're doing sometimes. And convene multi-stakeholder forums, because if you've got a problem, there may be other organizations around the project that have the same problem. Why not work together? You can get more done collaboratively. And besides, a lot of these problems you don't have the power to solve by yourself. And while collaborating, alter the network structure. If you know the network structure, you can deliberately create linkages that will make your supporters more influential. So to sum it up, what kind of projects have a higher social license? What kind have a lower? There was a study done on this with mining projects. The ones that were more successful, the managers, the ones where there are more conflict, the managers define their jobs in strictly engineering terms and tried to stay out of the stakeholder politics and tried to keep a low profile. That didn't work so well. The ones that were more successful and had fewer conflicts were the ones where they accepted their interorganizational diplomacy as part of the job and engaged forthrightly with their stakeholders and tried to get other parts of the company involved too and other organizations involved. Thank you.